Professor Richard Holmes once said something along the lines of, "War, despite all its drawbacks, does make for cracking history." This is quite true. Military history does provide us with enthralling tales of sacrifice, great bravery and courage, as well as those times when humanity manages to shine through the horror that is warfare. However, for each such story of valour or dedication there is one of sadness and loss, as a reminder of the futility and pointlessness of human conflict. This is one such story: the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff. If asked to name a costly maritime disaster, most people would cite either the Titanic or the Lusitania. There are few who have heard of the Wilhelm Gustloff. The MV Wilhelm Gustloff was a German ship constructed by the Blumenvoss shipyards and launched in May 1937. She was named at Hitler's request after the leader of the National Socialist Party's Swiss branch, who was assassinated in 1936. She was built as a cruise liner for the German Labour Front and used by the Strength Through Joy movement, providing holidays, cruises and entertainment for German workers until 1939. Her military service began with returning Condor Legion servicemen back from Spain, and then as a hospital ship until late 1940. Her next role was as a floating U-boat barracks for the 2nd U-boat Training Division in Gottenhofen, modern-day Gdynia, in Poland. She sat at the dockside for 4 years. Eventually, however, with the Red Army approaching, the Germans instigated Operation Hannibal, the evacuation of Germans from East Prussia and occupied Poland. Her final voyage was to evacuate German refugees and military personnel, as well as technicians who had worked on advanced weapon projects, from the Baltic to the relative safety of Kiel. The ship's complement and passenger lists cited just over 6,000 people on board when she sailed. However, many civilians boarded the ship without being recorded in the ship's official embarkation records, and extensive research in the 1980s and 90s hold the totals as a crew of 918 officers, NCOs and men of the 2nd U-boat Training Division, 373 female naval auxiliary helpers, 162 wounded soldiers, and 8,956 civilians, for a total of 10,582, approximately half of them children. Besides the soldiers, the passengers included Nazi dignitaries as well as members of the Gestapo. It was in the early hours of the 30th of January 1945 when the ship finally dropped anchor and set off on her perilous journey to Kiel. She was accompanied by the passenger liner Hansa and 2 torpedo boats. The Hansa, however, along with one of the escorts, developed mechanical problems, and the Gustloff, on a single escort, continued alone. Her route was the subject of much disagreement between the multiple captains on board: the Gustloff's own captain, merchant captains, and a U-boat commander. Eventually, Friedrich Petersen, the Gustloff's captain, decided to head for deeper water, known to have been swept for mines, rather than the shallow water coast-hugging route suggested by military personnel on board. He also activated the ship's navigation lights for fear of collision with other ships. The ship had been repainted from her hospital colours when she started life as a barracks, and so now, painted grey and armed with anti-aircraft guns, she was not afforded any of the protections international law gave to hospital ships. At about 7 p.m. that evening, a Soviet S-class submarine, the S-13, under the command of Alexander Marinesko, sighted the pair of ships and began shadowing them. Unknown to the submarine's crew, however, the weapons on board the Gustloff and her escort, the Lowe, had frozen, along with the Lowe's detection equipment, leaving them defenceless. Approximately 2 hours later, when 90 miles offshore, the commander of the S-13 fired 3 torpedoes at the port side of the Gustloff. All 3 found their target, one hitting the bow, one the stern, and one amidships. The Gustloff immediately began to list and go down by the head. As a result of the impact, a large number of crew had been trapped by watertight doors in the bow, and all but 3 of the women's naval auxiliaries had been killed. The ship lost all power. Due to this power loss, only 1 lifeboat was successfully lowered. Others, iced onto their davits, had to be hammered free, some being damaged, destroyed, or capsizing when hitting the water. The water was cold. With ice floating all around and the air temperature as low as minus 18 degrees centigrade, the Gustloff sank in just 40 minutes, 144 feet below the surface. Several boats came to the aid of the survivors, and 1,252 were saved, the rest perishing either trapped on the Gustloff, drowning, or from exposure. 9,343 souls are now recorded as lost in the disaster. Why then has the Gustloff remained relatively forgotten when compared to more well-known sinkings? Was it because it occurred during wartime, especially in the confused days that were the collapse of Germany? Because she belonged to the losing side? Or the news of the sinking was repressed by the Nazi leadership at the time for morale reasons? Whatever the reason, it is by far, in terms of human life, the most costly single-vessel maritime disaster in history.